The situation gets even more complicated, however, with the fact that, armed struggle wasn't the only strategy in town. They weren't the only game in town. And this is exemplified by the electoral victory in 1970 of Salvador Allende Gossens, Socialist Party candidate in Chile, during Chile's experiment with democratic socialism. This was an unprecedented event where a leftist coalition made up of socialists, communists, Christian Democrats, radicals of all stripe in a popular front, a popular coalition, ran for office in an attempt to enact democratic socialism in Chile. In 1970, Salvador Allende won by a very narrow margin and began the process of building democratic socialism in Chile. And this is extremely significant because this proved to be no more acceptable to Washington than the Cuban model did, than the model of guerrilla armed struggle and socialism through the barrel of the gun. This was no less threatening to the United States. And this was done by peaceful means, right? This was a revolution through the ballot box. Salvador Allende's coalition government would only last 3 years before it was overthrown in a US-backed military coup in 1973 that installed a brutal military dictatorship led by Augusto Pinochet. Now, you may ask yourself, why? Why did the then, in 1970, the Nixon administration feel the need to crush a democratically elected government in Chile? These were not guerrillas, right? Well, these were not young people taking to the mountains with rifles in their hands. What was threatening about this? Well, think about that for a moment. Step back for a moment and think about all of these interventions, and not just in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, the whole of the Vietnam War, costing tens of thousands of lives on the U.S. side, many more on the Vietnamese side, had been sold to the American public as a struggle against communism, as a struggle against this very Stalinist, monolithic communism that Washington was selling to the American public. This domino theory idea, and many ordinary people went along with this. So what happens if you have a democratically elected leftist in the hemisphere, where even by a slight margin, they win an election, they enact reforms? What happens if in the next election they don't stay, they don't become the big bad, scary communist dictatorship that people fear? What happens if they go quietly, if they're elected out in the next election? And democracy is maintained, electoral democracy, revolution through the ballot box, is a model that leftists respect and adhere to in Chile. Well, then the preconceived notions that would allow for to justify, right, that would justify armed interventions all over Latin America and the world in general would fall on their face. There would be no more argument. There would be no more justification, because the public, the American public, could see that these things could be done peacefully. That, in some ways, was an even scarier example than these guerrillas taking power through armed struggle. And this example was unacceptable to them, and it was unfortunately drowned in blood. On September 11th, 1973, the Pinochet dictatorship came to power through a US-backed coup. And this enacted a brutal period in US involvement in Latin America, particularly in South America and in the Southern Cone, something that the CIA calls Operation Condor, in which military dictatorships backed by the United States were installed in Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, and these in the same way. It's quite interesting in its brutality, actually. In the same way that Cuban revolutionaries and guerrilla movements, insurgencies all around the region tried to internationalize their revolutionary struggle, the CIA, with the help of these right-wing military dictatorships, internationalized their counterinsurgency. They internationalized their repression against suspected leftists and progressives in general. In particular, the Argentine and Chilean case were famously brutal. The image you see on the right is just the accepted sort of death toll of these military dictatorships in the Operation Condor era. So this is a particularly brutal and heavy-handed episode and an era in the U.S. relationship with Latin America. But following this particular black mark on the era, we finally see in 1979 another revolutionary example that bursts onto the scene. After nearly 20 years of off again, on again insurgency, the Sandinista National Liberation Front, following a popular armed struggle, comes to power in 1979 after the overthrow of the Somoza dynasty. And this was a revolutionary movement. This was the first one since the Cubans, since 1959, where a guerrilla movement had taken power through force of arms. And like with the Cubans before them, the Nicaraguan revolutionaries became very popular. They became another one of these alternatives, right? A popular front coalition that comes to power and begins to enact reforms. The United States immediately begins, like they did with the Cubans, to back counter-revolutionary forces, which develops, this process develops into a long and bloody civil war that really just decimates the Nicaraguan countryside. And so once again, these things, these experiments, these radical political experiments are very rarely allowed by Washington to see themselves through. And they were almost immediately infringed upon. The United States backed what they call the Contras, or the counter-revolutionary forces, in which a low-intensity civil war breaks out, which really bleeds the country dry. And makes the popular reforms, things like land reform, like a literacy campaign, many of the things that the Cubans enacted, it made it far more difficult for the Nicaraguans to enact. And these interventions were also met with resistance in the United States. I want to take this as an opportunity to also draw some attention to the fact that almost none of these interventions in Latin America ever were met with silence by the American public. There were always segments of society here in the United States that resisted, going all the way back to Mark Twain, who was very much against the annexation of Puerto Rico and the invasion of Cuba. And you fast forward to the Reagan administration, which is what the era we're talking about here with the Sandinista victory. There were students, there were young people, there were labor unions, there was clergy, right, that rejected the brutality that was just being heaped on Central America on the part of these, by these counter-revolutionaries that were on Washington's payroll. And so there was widespread resistance to this in the United States. This era that we're describing here, right, the 1970s and the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, was a period of armed struggle and brutal civil war in Central America. Things did not quiet down after the Sandinista victory, right? The Contra War really picked up, and this is during guerrilla insurgencies in El Salvador and in Guatemala. In the latter case, the Guatemalan military, with U.S. backing, committed genocide. This is one of these few cases where the civil war devolves into genocide against the indigenous population. So particularly the 1980s are a really brutal era in Central America, and it's largely because these military regimes refuse to cede power to popular protest or to armed struggle, and the United States refuses to cut ties with them at this time. There was genocide in Guatemala, the assassination of the Archbishop Oscar Romero in El Salvador by right-wing death squads, all of which is U.S. backed, right? These are things that have really been seared into the memory of people in this region that made in the 1980s Central America quite a turbulence. Turbulence is an understatement. But these constant, emergence of radical alternatives to the status quo in Latin America and the Caribbean don't stop, right? It's an important part of the resistance to sort of Washington's hegemony in the region, that even with all this brutality, experimentation, political radicalism isn't ever completely crushed. And once again, we see another one of these alternatives emerge in 1979, right? Just like there was a 1959 moment with the victory of the Cuban Revolution, there was absolutely a 1979 moment that is often written out of the narrative. This is something that really threatened Washington's hegemony in the region because of all the things that were going on in this hemisphere at that time. You have the Sandinista victory in 1979. You have a popular leftist revolution that takes power in Grenada under Maurice Bishop, who you see pictured here. The Cubans support both of these revolutionary movements. The Cubans, they initiate aid programs to all of these various movements following, the triumph of the Sandinistas. There was a democratic socialist in power in Jamaica. There was a democratic socialist in power in Guyana. This is the same year of the Iranian Revolution and all the controversy that brought. So very much there was a perception in Washington that the status quo of U.S. hegemony was once again under threat, and they really kicked into high gear um, efforts to undermine these revolutionary struggles, be they the Sandinistas or in particular the Grenada Revolution, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But it is important to note that radicalism, these alternatives, these attempts, agree with them or not, right? We can argue about our own personal politics, but agree with them or not, it is impressive that these revolutionary experiments don't stop and they are constantly springing up throughout um, all of these periods of U.S. intervention. Right? And it does come down to this idea that goes all the way back to the two Americas, the Americano idea, the idea that national ambitions and pan-Latin ambitions were a threat, an economic threat, and a political threat to Washington's hegemony in the region. And there's really no other way to phrase that.